Thomas Jefferson, one of the most influential figures in American history, was born on April 13, 1743, at the Shadwell Plantation. This estate, located just outside Charlottesville, Virginia, was part of the prosperous holdings of his father, Peter Jefferson. Peter was a man of significant standing in Colonial Virginia, working as both a surveyor and a planter. He owned multiple plantations including Shadwell, which he had established in the 1730s. Like many plantations of that era, Shadwell relied on enslaved labor alongside free workers to sustain its operations, primarily focused on tobacco cultivation. During Jefferson's early years, Virginia was one of the 13 British colonies in North America. However, within a few decades, it would become a leading state in the revolutionary movement that led to the creation of the United States of America. The Jefferson family had deep roots in Virginia, tracing their presence back to 1612. Peter Jefferson was a prominent member of Virginia society, holding respected roles such as a colonel in the militia and a representative in the Virginia House of Burgesses. His leadership and influence left a lasting impression on young Thomas, who admired his father's ability to command respect and maintain authority within the community. Jefferson's mother, Jane Randolph, came from an equally prestigious background. She was a member of the Randolph family, one of the most influential in Virginia's history. The Randolphs had arrived in the colony in 1642, and by the 1670s Jane's grandfather, William Randolph, had amassed tens of thousands of acres of land, establishing a network of 11 plantations. Jane's father, Isham Randolph, was a sea captain whose life alternated between Virginia and London. It was in London, specifically in the Shadwell parish, that Jane was born in February 1720. When she married Peter Jefferson in 1739, they named their plantation Shadwell, a nod to her birthplace. Together, Peter and Jane Jefferson had 8 children, 6 daughters and 2 sons, with Thomas being the eldest. Raised amidst the privileges of the Virginia elite, Thomas spent much of his childhood between 2 estates, Shadwell and Tuckahoe. In 1745, the Jefferson family temporarily moved to Tuckahoe so Peter could oversee the management of the estate, which belonged to his late cousin William Randolph. 7 years later, in 1752, they returned to Shadwell, where Thomas continued his upbringing. Peter Jefferson deeply regretted his lack of formal education and was determined that his son would receive the best schooling available. At the age of 9, Thomas was sent to live with Reverend William Douglas, a clergyman who provided him with foundational lessons in French, as well as in Latin and Greek. Later, he studied under Reverend James Morey, a more accomplished classical scholar, who introduced Thomas to the literature, philosophy, and history of ancient Greece and Rome. This early exposure to classical ideas profoundly shaped Jefferson's intellectual development. Building on this solid foundation, Jefferson enrolled at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia's capital. By the time he left for college, his father had passed away in 1757, leaving Thomas at just 14 years old, as the head of his household. As the eldest son, he inherited the Shadwell estate, which included more than 2,750 acres of land and 66 enslaved individuals. However, the practical management of the estate was handled by his mother Jane, who ensured its continued operation. In 1770, a fire devastated the Shadwell home, reducing it to ruins. Undeterred, Jane Jefferson took it upon herself to rebuild the residence, which remained in the family for 2 subsequent generations. Although much of the correspondence between Thomas and his mother was lost in the fire, evidence suggests that their relationship was amicable. Jefferson continued to live at Shadwell well into adulthood, indicating a stable bond with his mother until her death in 1776. At William and Mary, Jefferson immersed himself in a rigorous academic environment. He studied under Dr. William Small, a Scottish professor who taught mathematics and moral philosophy. Small's teachings introduced Jefferson to the revolutionary ideas of the Enlightenment, an intellectual movement that emphasized reason, science, and human progress over tradition and religious dogma. These concepts had a profound impact on Jefferson, shaping his views on governance and society. Jefferson's academic life was intense. He was known to study for as many as 15 hours a day, devouring works by luminaries such as Isaac Newton, John Locke, and Adam Smith. Despite his heavy study schedule, Jefferson maintained a commitment to physical activity, exercising for 2 hours daily. An accomplished violinist, he also performed regularly at the governor's palace in Williamsburg, where he mingled with Virginia's political elite, including his cousin Peyton Randolph, the Royal Attorney General. The colonial government in Virginia mirrored the structure of the British political system. The king appointed the governor and the Council of State, which acted as the upper house of the General Assembly. The lower house, known as the House of Burgesses, was elected by free white men. Peter Jefferson had represented Albemarle County in the House of Burgesses, and he instilled in his son a strong sense of loyalty to the British Crown. After completing his studies, Jefferson spent 5 years training as a lawyer. He divided his time between Williamsburg and Shadwell during a period when tensions between Britain and its American colonies were steadily rising. These tensions were fueled by Britain's efforts to recover the costs of the 7 Years' War, 1754 to 1763, a global conflict in which Britain had secured significant territorial gains in North America. Although Britain emerged victorious, gaining control of French colonies in Canada and Spanish Florida, the war left the empire heavily indebted. To cover the expenses of maintaining a military presence in North America, British authorities introduced new taxes on the colonies. In 1764, Prime Minister George Grenville announced the Sugar Act, imposing duties on various colonial imports. Grenville declared Parliament's absolute authority to levy taxes across the British Empire, a stance that provoked outrage in the colonies. Virginia, like other colonies, objected vehemently to these measures, asserting that taxes should not be imposed without the consent of colonial representatives. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," became a rallying cry. The situation escalated with the passage of the Stamp Act in 1765, which taxed printed materials, sparking widespread protests organized by groups like the Sons of Liberty. This Boston-founded organization rapidly expanded across the colonies, fueling resistance against British policies. Thomas Jefferson, a keen observer of the passionate debates within the Virginia House of Burgesses, was notably influenced by the speeches of Patrick Henry. Henry, a lawyer renowned for his fiery oratory, became an advocate for the most radical measures of resistance against British policies. His denunciations of the British Crown and Parliament were so vehement that many of his more conservative colleagues accused him of treason. Yet despite the intense rhetoric, even the most outspoken figures like Henry were not advocating for the 13 colonies to sever ties with the British Crown, nor were they suggesting the use of armed conflict to achieve independence. By the end of 1765, the mounting colonial opposition to the Stamp Act prompted the British Parliament to recognize the depth of discontent in the American colonies. The act, which had levied taxes on printed materials, was repealed in February 1766. However, Parliament simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, affirming its authority to legislate for the colonies, in all cases whatsoever. While the Declaratory Act was intended to preserve Parliament's dignity, it did little to pacify the colonies. The ongoing disputes had evolved from debates about taxation into broader issues concerning political rights and resistance to arbitrary governance. Over the next decade, repeated attempts by Britain to enforce its authority were met with increasing defiance from the colonies. Tensions escalated to the point where the conflict shifted from political discourse to armed confrontation, setting the stage for revolution. During this period, Jefferson embarked on a promising legal career after being admitted to the bar in 1767. Living at Shadwell, his family estate, he traveled extensively to argue cases in courthouses throughout Virginia. His political career began shortly thereafter, as he was elected on December 15, 1768, to represent Albemarle County in the House of Burgesses. This marked the first of many public offices he would hold in a career that would define his legacy. In May of that same year, Jefferson had initiated plans to construct a new residence on a hilltop near Shadwell. He named this estate Monticello, meaning "little mountain" in Italian. Designed by Jefferson himself and constantly remodeled to align with contemporary architectural trends, Monticello would become synonymous with his name. The devastating fire at Shadwell in 1770 accelerated his move to Monticello, despite the house being incomplete. The fire destroyed Jefferson's library and the legal papers he was working on at the time. Nevertheless, Monticello became his permanent home and a symbol of his ingenuity and vision. It was to Monticello that Jefferson brought his wife, Martha Wales Jefferson, following their marriage in January 1772. Known as Patty to her family and close friends, Martha was born in 1748 into a prominent Virginia family. Her father, John Wales, was both a wealthy landowner and a client of Jefferson during his legal career. After being widowed at a young age in 1768, Martha attracted the attention of numerous suitors including Jefferson. The two bonded over their shared love of music, with Jefferson often serenading her on the violin while she accompanied him on the piano. Their marriage, although occasionally marked by disagreements due to Martha's strong-willed nature, was a loving one. Together, they had 6 children, though only 2 survived infancy, reflecting the high child mortality rates of the era. As Jefferson's personal life unfolded, the colony's relationship with Britain continued to deteriorate. The Boston Tea Party on December 16, 1773, saw members of the Sons of Liberty destroy a shipment of tea in protest against British taxation. This act of defiance prompted Parliament to pass the Intolerable Acts in 1774, including the Boston Port Act, which closed the port until the East India Company was compensated for the lost tea. These punitive measures further galvanized colonial opposition. In Virginia, Jefferson and his peers passed resolutions expressing solidarity with Boston and advocating a boycott of British goods. Amidst the growing unrest, the First Continental Congress convened on September 5, 1774, in Philadelphia. Although Jefferson was not a delegate, he made a significant contribution by drafting a document titled A Summary View of the Rights of British America. In this pamphlet, Jefferson articulated the colony's grievances and argued for their right to self-governance, urging King George III to address these issues fairly. His eloquent plea for equality and justice elevated him to prominence among colonial leaders, showcasing his exceptional abilities as a political writer. By late 1774, it became evident that reconciliation between Britain and its American colonies was unlikely. Both sides prepared for conflict, with the colonies mobilizing militias to counter potential military crackdowns. The situation reached a breaking point on April 19, 1775, when the first shots of the American Revolutionary War were fired at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. This marked the beginning of an armed struggle that would ultimately lead to the birth of a new nation. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in May 1775, initially under the presidency of Peyton Randolph. However, Randolph was soon recalled to Williamsburg to oversee the proceedings of the Virginia House of Burgesses. In his absence, Thomas Jefferson was chosen as his replacement, arriving in Philadelphia on June 11. By this time, the escalating hostilities between Britain and the colonies had transformed the Congress into a permanent governing body, tasked with uniting the colonies in their resistance and coordinating efforts in what was rapidly evolving into a full-scale war. Shortly after Jefferson's arrival, the Congress approved John Adams's proposal to appoint George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, a pivotal step in organizing the colonial forces. Unlike some of his peers, Jefferson was not a gifted orator. He preferred working behind the scenes, contributing his talents in drafting resolutions, declarations, and reports. His mastery of the written word allowed him to influence policy and public opinion from a quieter, more strategic position. By June 1776, the Congress had begun deliberations on the critical issue of whether to formally declare independence from the British Empire. Jefferson, alongside John Adams, was selected to draft the declaration. Recognizing Jefferson's superior writing skills and his role as a representative of Virginia, the largest and most influential colony, Adams persuaded him to compose the initial draft. Jefferson's draft began with an introduction articulating the colony's intent to sever ties with the British Crown. The preamble, however, became the cornerstone of the Declaration of Independence, encapsulating the foundational principles of the emerging nation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form, as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. This powerful statement was followed by an extensive list of grievances against King George III. Jefferson framed the monarch as the primary antagonist, effectively prosecuting him in the court of public opinion. This deliberate shift away from blaming Parliament ensured that reconciliation would no longer be possible, as the king had previously been viewed as a protector of colonial rights. When Jefferson's draft was debated by Congress, several alterations were made to moderate its tone and content. A particularly contentious passage condemning slavery and the transatlantic slave trade was removed to appease delegates from the southern colonies, whose economies were deeply reliant on enslaved labor. Although Jefferson expressed disappointment at these revisions, he took pride in knowing that the document ratified on July 4, 1776, contained words that would resonate through the ages. Having gained international recognition as a principal advocate for American independence, Jefferson yearned to return to Virginia. His personal life had been marked by loss. In the preceding year he had endured the deaths of his mother, one of his daughters, and his cousin, Peyton Randolph. Adding to his burdens, Jefferson's wife Martha was in fragile health. For these reasons, he declined an invitation to join a diplomatic mission to France aimed at securing an alliance with King Louis XVI. While Jefferson remained in Virginia, the Franco-American alliance was successfully formalized in February 1778, giving the colonies a crucial advantage. Jefferson turned his focus to reforming Virginia's legal and political systems, striving to dismantle the entrenched power of the landed elite and broaden access to education. He was particularly devoted to the cause of religious freedom, arguing that no faith could claim absolute truth. Although his proposals for religious tolerance were initially rejected, they would be revisited and adopted a decade later. On the issue of slavery, Jefferson found himself in a complex moral quandary. While he opposed the institution in principle and saw it as incompatible with the ideals of liberty, he remained a slaveholder throughout his life, owning over 600 individuals. Jefferson doubted the possibility of coexistence between free black and white populations, a perspective that shaped his actions or lack thereof on this issue. As the Revolutionary War raged on, Virginia faced increasing threats from British forces. In 1779, Jefferson was elected governor of Virginia, assuming the role of civilian war leader during a period of immense peril. He dealt with internal Loyalist uprisings and Native American raids while relocating the state capital from Williamsburg to Richmond, a safer inland location. Despite these precautions, Virginia was invaded in December 1780 by Benedict Arnold, a former Continental Army general who had defected to the British. Jefferson's response was slow, narrowly avoiding capture as Arnold's troops sacked Richmond. The British campaign escalated in the spring of 1781, with Lord Cornwallis and Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton leading a brutal southern offensive. Jefferson relocated the capital again, this time to Charlottesville, and urgently appealed to George Washington for reinforcements to save Virginia from collapse. In the early hours of June 4, 1781, as Thomas Jefferson prepared to relinquish his position as governor of Virginia, he was at Monticello when alarming news reached him. British cavalry under the command of Bannister Tarleton was approaching his estate with orders to capture him. Once again, Jefferson narrowly escaped British hands, fleeing just in time. After stepping down as governor, Jefferson faced scrutiny from the Virginia General Assembly regarding his actions during the tumultuous final year of his term. Although he was ultimately exonerated of any wrongdoing, Jefferson felt that his reputation had been tarnished. This sense of disillusionment persisted, even as the tide of the war turned in favor of the Americans. On October 19, 1781, Lord Cornwallis surrendered to General George Washington and his French allies at Yorktown, effectively ending large-scale hostilities and paving the way for peace talks that would recognize American independence. Jefferson's political struggles were soon overshadowed by personal tragedy. His wife Martha gave birth to a daughter in May 1782, but her health rapidly declined thereafter. Confined to bed, she passed away on September 6, 1782, with Jefferson by her side. In the midst of his grief, Jefferson accepted an invitation in 1783 to join the American delegation engaged in peace negotiations in Paris. However, before his departure, he learned that the treaty's draft terms had already been agreed upon, offering the fledgling United States remarkably favorable conditions. These terms were designed to isolate France and Spain, America's allies, from further territorial or political gains. Instead, Jefferson was elected on June 6, 1783, to represent Virginia at the Continental Congress, a fragile national body with limited authority. Jefferson believed that the weaknesses of the Congress posed a risk of disunity and potential conflict among the states. This became evident when Congress struggled to assemble the necessary quorum to ratify the Treaty of Paris, which was only achieved on January 14, 1784. On July 5, 1784, after less than a year in Congress, Jefferson embarked on a diplomatic mission to France as the United States ambassador. Jefferson had long admired France, particularly for its alliance with America during the Revolutionary War, and he saw this appointment as an opportunity to strengthen ties and ensure American security in the event of future British aggression. Jefferson's time in France coincided with the nation's descent into revolution. King Louis XVI's government was deeply in debt, exacerbated by France's military support of the American Revolution. While the French common people faced dire poverty and hunger, the aristocracy and the Catholic Church resisted efforts to impose taxes on their wealth. With few options remaining, the king reluctantly convened the Estates General in 1789, a political assembly that had not been called in over 150 years. The gathering of the Estates General led to a surge of proposals for reform, as representatives from the church, nobility, and commoners debated the future of French governance. Jefferson observed these developments closely, welcoming the possibility of an end to royal absolutism. Even while stationed in Paris, Jefferson remained deeply involved in American affairs. He closely followed the Constitutional Convention held in Philadelphia from May 25 to September 17, 1787, where delegates sought to establish a stronger federal government. Though Jefferson had previously criticized the weaknesses of the national government under the Articles of Confederation, his experiences in revolutionary France caused him to fear that an overly powerful central government could lead to tyranny. When Jefferson reviewed the draft constitution, he approved of its separation of powers among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. However, he expressed concerns about the presidency, which lacked term limits and could potentially allow a single individual to remain in office indefinitely. He was also disappointed by the absence of a Bill of Rights to safeguard individual and state freedoms against federal overreach. Despite its imperfections, Jefferson supported the Constitution, trusting that it could be improved through amendments. This faith was validated when a Bill of Rights was adopted as the first 10 amendments before the Constitution's ratification on June 21, 1788. During Jefferson's final months in France, the French Revolution erupted. Unable to resolve procedural disputes, representatives of the Third Estate, the commoners, declared themselves the National Assembly. As unrest spread, royal authority crumbled, culminating in the storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789. Jefferson maintained close friendships with key revolutionaries, including the Marquis de Lafayette, who had fought alongside Washington during the American Revolution. Lafayette, then one of France's most admired figures, served as commander of the National Guard, tasked with maintaining order in Paris and protecting the royal family from radical factions. Collaborating with Lafayette, Jefferson helped draft the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, adopted by the National Assembly on August 26, 1789. This landmark document, which proclaimed that human beings are born and remain free and equal in rights, echoed the principles Jefferson had articulated in the Declaration of Independence. Having contributed significantly to both French and American political developments, Jefferson left France in late September 1789. Returning to Virginia on November 23, he planned to resume his diplomatic duties. However, in December, he was appointed Secretary of State by President George Washington, who had been unanimously elected under the new Constitution and inaugurated on April 30, 1789. As Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson assumed the role of President George Washington's chief foreign policy advisor, a position well suited to his extensive diplomatic experience in France and his deep understanding of international relations. Accepting Washington's invitation, Jefferson departed Virginia for New York, which at the time served as the nation's capital, and officially began his duties in March 1790. While Jefferson's primary responsibilities centered on managing the young nation's foreign affairs, his role as a member of Washington's cabinet inevitably involved him in the broader debates shaping the United States' political future. The cabinet itself was composed of individuals with diverse visions for the country's path forward, reflecting a range of perspectives on governance, economics, and federal authority. Jefferson's voice in these discussions often emphasized the importance of individual liberty, state sovereignty, and a restrained federal government, aligning with his philosophical convictions. Would you like a deeper dive into his tenure as Secretary of State, including his clashes with Alexander Hamilton or his foreign policy decisions? If you wish, stay tuned for part 2. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video helpful and inspiring. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content like this. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know what topics you'd like to see next. Until then, keep striving for success, and see you in the next video.